Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 8, April to May, 1931.
Having surveyed the situation that developed in the United States during the opening stages of the war, it will be appropriate to bring under review the trend of events in the Far East in the same period. Thanks to the rigorous Japanese censorship, which extended far beyond the confines of Japan, being particularly efficacious in those provinces of China that were under Japanese control, news from the Asiatic side was meager and unreliable. Judging from the bulletins emanating from Tokyo, the teeming millions of China had made Japan's cause their own, hailing her as their champion against the white interlopers who had sought to bring the peoples of the East under their domination. So friendly was popular sentiment in China, the bulletins avowed, that the Japanese garrisons in Manchuria were being reduced, and large reinforcements had thus become available for the main army of operations. Neither in Korea nor Formosa, it was added, had any symptoms of unrest appeared. Both colonies were giving proofs of unswerving loyalty to Japan, who was thus left free to devote all her energies to the defeat of her arrogant foe. As for the Japanese people, their martial fervor remains undiminished, the world was assured. Victory at all costs is the slogan heard on every hand. While there was for the moment no means of checking these statements as to the morale of the Japanese masses, it soon became known through other channels that the attitude of China had been grossly misrepresented by the Tokyo bulletins. So far from espousing the Japanese cause, the central government at Peking was already adopting a policy that bade fair to cause serious embarrassment to Japan. One of its first actions was to place an embargo on the export not only of arms and munitions, but of raw materials susceptible of conversion into munitions of war. Within this category were placed coal, iron ore, and other minerals that were going to Japan in enormous quantities. Had the embargo been effective, it must speedily have crippled Japan's war effort and compelled her to discontinue the struggle. But since the central government's writ did not run in the provinces under Japanese control, which were precisely those richest in mineral resources, the edict could not be enforced. Nevertheless, the fact that it had been issued afforded clear proof of China's latent hostility to her powerful neighbor. When the embargo was ignored, Peking addressed a note to the powers, charging Japan with violation of Chinese neutrality and reserving the right to take countermeasures. And so, even at this early stage, Japan had to reckon with the possibility of serious trouble in a quarter where she had interests of vital importance. As we have seen, so far from reducing her garrisons there, she had found it expedient to reinforce them. Nor was the ill will of China limited to diplomatic protests, for it was well known that Chinese emissaries with ample funds at their disposal were behind the insurgents in Korea, where the whole country seemed to be ripe for revolt. Tokyo had a further cause for anxiety in the attitude of Russia, whose government was already displaying a tendency to fish in troubled waters. Of the many controversial issues between Japan and Russia, that of Sakhalin had become most acute. For 10 years, the northern or Russian half of this island had been held by the Japanese, who had gone there in April 1920, as a reprisal for the massacre of 700 of their nationals by Bolshevik partisans at Nikolaevsk. The subsequent discovery of rich oil fields in the territory thus seized made Japan very loath to part with it, and all Russia's efforts to recover her property had proved abortive. The agreement signed in January 1925, which aimed at composing these differences, had but a brief duration, being denounced by Russia 2 years later on the ground of alleged Japanese violation. Now, however, Japan's preoccupation with the war gave the Soviet rulers the opportunity for which they had been waiting. Barely a month after the outbreak of hostilities, a note was addressed to Tokyo, demanding not only the immediate and complete evacuation of northern Sakhalin, but a recognition of Russian rights over the Chinese Eastern Railway in Manchuria, to which Japan had hitherto refused so much as to listen. It will be recalled that in 1924, during one of the chronic civil wars, which had been the curse of China ever since the Revolution of 1912, the Russians had contrived to regain their former dominating influence in the management of the Chinese Eastern Railway as the price of their support of Chang Solin, the Manchurian Tu Chun, in his victorious campaign against his rival, Wu Peifu. Though this control remained effective locally, the retrocession of the railroad had never been recognized de jure by any power other than China. Although not an ultimatum, the note from Moscow was couched in somewhat peremptory terms, and arriving at a time when persistent reports of big military concentrations on the Manchurian frontier were current, it alarmed the Japanese government more than they cared to admit. Their interest lay in keeping Russia neutral at almost any price. Yet this, it appeared, would necessitate bitter sacrifices, entailing more than a mere loss of prestige. By restoring northern Sakhalin to its former owners, Japan would lose what had become one of her principal reservoirs of oil. As it was, the stocks of this precious fuel were none too large, and the naval authorities were already making anxious search for new sources of supply, which, of course, were strictly limited. Research work had for some time been in progress at the Fushun Colliery in southern Manchuria in the hope of producing fresh reserves of crude oil by means of dry distillation from shale. High hopes had been founded on this source, but after lengthy experiments had been carried out at considerable expense, it was found that only meager supplies of oil of inferior quality could be obtained, at a cost out of proportion to their value. Boring for oil in Formosa, though less disappointing, did not yield petroleum in quantities adequate to the needs of the country in wartime. The only other source which promised well was a new area which Japanese experts had located in the island of Mindanao in the southern Philippines. The chief objection to this oil field was its distance from a convenient port, as it was situated very near the center of the island, which has an area of close on 37,000 square miles. As a natural consequence, the chief of the naval staff entered a weighty protest against any hasty acceptance of the Russian demands, emphasizing that Japan's renunciation of the Sakhalin oil fields would be likely to lose her the war. Yet it was only too clear that the ultimate retrocession of this otherwise unimportant territory was but one, and that not the greatest of the sacrifices which Japan would be called upon to make if she wished to assure the neutrality of her formidable neighbor. To provoke Russian enmity at this juncture was clearly madness. None knew better than the statesmen of Japan that the imperialist traditions of the Tsarist regime had survived the revolution of 1917, and that Russia still turned covetous eyes on the rich lands of Manchuria and Mongolia, which she was only too eager to bring under her sway, should circumstances afford her the opportunity. Sooner or later, as most Japanese believed, another war would have to be fought with Russia for the control of China. Since 1904, when Japan had risked her very existence by challenging the mighty colossus of the North, because she regarded the extirpation of Muscovite influence in Manchuria as vital to the future safety of the empire, her own stake in China had become immeasurably greater, so great indeed that it was now one of the main sources of her national strength and prosperity. Ostensibly, at least, the present war was being waged to resist American encroachment on this preserve. But although Russia was recognized as a potential enemy, this was certainly not the time to provoke a clash with her. It was of the first importance that she should be placated until the present struggle had been brought to a conclusion. The naval staff was accordingly informed by the Foreign Office that negotiations for the return of northern Sakhalin were about to be set in train, but that every effort would be made to prolong them. As for the Russian claims in regard to the Chinese Eastern Railway, which involved nothing less than the control of this line from the western Manchurian frontier to the Ussuri Railway at Nikolsk, these were at once accepted, in principle, by Japan, who suggested the holding of a conference at Chita to settle the details. Doubtless she hoped that before the proceedings had committed her to any definite pledge, a fortunate turn in the tide of war would enable her to drop the mask of conciliation and show a defiant front to Russia. Such, then, were the grave political embarrassments with which Japan had to contend almost at the beginning of her duel with the United States. Already she was finding it needful to walk warily in her dealings with China and Russia, and it was fairly obvious that nothing but a succession of brilliant strokes against her immediate antagonist would clear the political horizon of the ominous clouds that were gathering. The effect upon Japanese trade of the cessation of intercourse with the United States was not long in making itself felt, and at the outset, some important industries were threatened with semi-paralysis from this cause. Before the war, Japan probably imported nearly half her supplies of raw cotton, an indispensable material for the manufacture of munitions, from the States, and this shortage had now to be made good from other sources, often at greatly enhanced prices. A similar situation existed to some extent with regard to iron and steel, to say nothing of petroleum. All these products were of inestimable value in wartime. Two of Japan's principal exports, silk and cotton goods, were also seriously threatened, since not only had the United States been one of her best customers for these, but the sudden shortage in the supply of raw cotton, accentuated by the commandeering of stocks for munition purposes, forced many industrial undertakings to work short time. Such a contingency had been foretold in pre-war days by certain Japanese publicists, despite the unpopularity of such predictions, but for some time it looked as though they had underestimated the effect upon Japanese trade of a war with her trans-Pacific neighbor. However, after the first few months, the inexorable laws of demand and supply asserted themselves, and trade found its way by devious channels through the artificial obstacles imposed by a state of war. Neutrals largely benefited, as each of the warring nations had good reason to know by the high prices they were compelled to pay for many necessaries of life. It is to be doubted whether they realized that no small proportion of these necessaries came from the enemy in the first place, though purporting to be of neutral origin. To repair the immediate deficiencies in raw materials, and at the same time build up a reserve of munitions equal to any conceivable demand, all available Japanese tonnage was quickly thrown into the trade with China, Australia, India, South Africa, and Europe, which for some considerable while was not interfered with by America's armed forces at sea. But American superiority in the field of finance soon began to tell, and Japan found that not only had she to pay exorbitant and ever-rising prices for many of her most pressing needs, but in some markets supplies were practically unobtainable, having been cornered by her opponent. Matters would have been much worse for Japan had not her government, apprehending some such impasse, promptly closed a number of huge forward contracts for such vital products as rice, cotton, wool, copper, iron, oil, etc. Even as it was, the Japanese public did not take kindly to intermittent scarcity combined with soaring prices. And though something was done to check profiteering by means of a system of government control, it was soon apparent that more energetic steps would have to be adopted if the morale of the nation were to be preserved. Neither combatant, it must be realized, was in an advantageous position to make any sustained attack upon the commerce of the other, owing to the immense distance separating them and the mutual lack of bases. It is true that at the outbreak of war, the United States maintained in the Mediterranean a squadron comprising the modern cruiser Trenton and a number of destroyers, but on the outbreak of war this force was recalled to home waters, in accordance with prearranged plans for fleet mobilization. Not until much later does it seem to have occurred to anyone in authority that it would have been a far sounder policy to have retained and reinforced this squadron with the object of interrupting the very important Japanese trade with Europe. The principal Japanese steamship line, the Nippon Yusen Kaisha, had the bulk of its large fleet of 100 vessels engaged on regular voyages between Japan and European ports, a number that was greatly augmented when the cessation of trade with the United States released a vast supply of fresh tonnage. It is now plain that serious interference with her Occidental traffic would have forced Japan into taking such action as would inevitably have led to an earlier decision. But seaborne trade not being a matter of vital concern to the United States, American strategists were slow to perceive that to Japan, no longer a self-supporting country, especially in time of war, it constituted one of her main arteries, which it should have been her adversary's first aim to sever. Only when disaster in other quarters had compelled a change in the naval strategy of the conflict was a more correct appreciation of the needs of the situation brought home to those Americans who had hitherto failed to grasp it. Comparatively few vessels of the Japanese mercantile marine fell into American hands at the outbreak of war, and even these were unimportant in size and value. There is no doubt that early warning must have been given of the imminence of hostilities, a fact of which the blocking of the Panama Canal by the Akashi Maru affords further proof. At the same time, however, a few people in Washington did evince a clearer perception of the difficulties confronting Japan. More than one member of the War Cabinet, it has since been affirmed, foresaw that Japan would eventually find herself assailed either by Russia or China, perhaps by both, and would then be compelled to make peace and restitution to the United States in order to free her hands for defense against these new enemies. This view no doubt appealed to some minds, because, if it were sound, it did away with the uncomfortable necessity for a more vigorous prosecution of the war. According to their arguments, it would suffice for America to stand on the defensive, taking only such measures as were necessary to protect her coastline and her floating trade, but without incurring the costs and hazards of operations in the war zone overseas. In other words, she should restrict her combatant energies to the minimum consistent with defense in the narrowest sense of the term, and for the rest, wait upon the march of events in the Far East, which would, they suggested, soon compel Japan to put forward peace proposals. This specious reasoning, however, failed to impress the majority of American strategists, nor did it escape criticism in the press, a section of which emphasized the folly of gambling on optimistic expectations which might at any moment be falsified. That Japan should have gone to war without first insuring herself against an attack in flank seemed quite incredible to thoughtful Americans, who remembered with what careful judgment she had selected the right moment for breaking off relations with Russia in 1904. At this time, be it remembered, the world was in ignorance of the domestic motives which had impelled Prince Kawamura and his colleagues to precipitate the war. Whether they had foreseen or fully estimated the dangers of complications with Russia and China must always remain in doubt. But it is clear from reports of the conference at Tokyo on the fateful 5th of January that they were prepared, if necessary, to take immense risks rather than allow their country to drift into revolution. While these discussions were going on at Washington, alarming news came from the Pacific. In pursuance of their policy of taking the initiative, and with the object of maintaining the morale of the populace, the Japanese had determined that the war must be carried to the enemy's coasts. Their first move in this direction was the laying of a series of minefields, the earliest of which were planted off the Hawaiian capital, Honolulu, in the island of Oahu, and Pearl Harbor, the naval station some few miles from it. This work appears to have been carried out by a 7,000-ton Japanese submarine of the type described in a previous chapter, and its first effect was to sink the United States Shipping Board steamer, Dewey, of 5,630 tons gross, immediately after she had sailed from Honolulu on May 20th. The local naval authorities acted promptly, suspending all departures and warning expected arrivals by radio, pending an investigation of the minefield's extent. Thanks to good organization and favorable weather, both groups of mines were located and swept up within a week, without further loss than the sinking of one auxiliary minesweeper. The United States Navy was favored by fortune on this occasion, since a considerable concentration of force had now been effected at Pearl Harbor, and the enemy's minefield might easily have revealed its existence by the sinking of some important warship. The next spot where mines were discovered was to the southward of Gammon Shoal, just outside the entrance to San Diego Bay. Here again matters might well have been more serious. A flotilla of destroyers ran into this minefield on leaving port for exercises on the morning of May 25th, the consequent casualties involving the loss of the Yarborough and Thompson, and the temporary disablement of the Ballard, Lobb, and Aaron Ward. Energetic measures resulted in the removal of the remaining mines without further loss. There is still considerable doubt as to the agency employed in this instance. Since no actual proof can be found of Japanese mine-laying submarines operating so far afield, the most probable explanation is that the mines had been laid by Japanese fishing craft, many of which before the war had followed their avocation off the Mexican coast of Lower California. This view was held by the naval authorities at San Diego, who thereupon established a patrol in Lower Californian waters to guard against a repetition of the incident. These measures threw a severe strain on American resources in the way of patrol vessels, in spite of the fact that a large number of auxiliary craft had been taken up for the purpose. Before closing this chapter, it is as well to set out the distribution of the United States fleet as it was left after the closing of the Panama Canal. There is no question but that the Japanese were kept well informed of such matters at this early period, as an effective censorship did not yet exist, and there was consequently a serious leakage of news through the American press. Excluding the Asiatic Squadron, which, with the exception of 2 destroyers, 7 submarines, and some unimportant units in Chinese rivers, had been practically wiped out when the Japanese descended on the Philippines, the following ships were in the Pacific: 12 battleships: West Virginia, Maryland, Colorado, California, Tennessee, New Mexico, Idaho, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Oklahoma, Nevada. 13 modern cruisers: Minneapolis, Portland, Kansas City, Indianapolis, Omaha, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Raleigh, Detroit, Richmond, Concord, Marblehead, Memphis. 3 more cruisers of the new 10,000-ton type were completing but not ready for sea. 7 older cruisers: Charlotte, Huntington, Huron, Seattle, Charleston, Salem, New Orleans. 2 aircraft carriers: Saratoga, Langley. 113 destroyers, first line, all of flush deck type. 41 submarines, including 6 of V-type, 16 of S-type, and 19 of R-type. 15 patrol vessels of Eagle type. 2 mine layers: Aroostook, Baltimore. 12 minesweepers of Bird class. 4 destroyer tenders: Altair, Rigel, Melville, Buffalo. 2 submarine tenders: Holland, Canopus. 2 repair ships: Medusa, Prometheus. 14 miscellaneous auxiliaries, including oilers, colliers, supply ships, hospital ships, etc. Very soon after the blocking of the Panama Canal, there had been concentrated at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the whole of the 12 battleships organized in 3 divisions of 4 ships each. 8 of the modern cruisers in 2 divisions of 4. The old cruiser Seattle as administrative flagship for the fleet. 36 destroyers in 6 divisions of 6 boats each, with the modern cruiser Concord as flagship and the tenders Altair, Rigel, and Melville attached. 6 submarines of V-type and 12 of S-type, with the tender Holland, 6 of the minesweepers, and about a dozen auxiliaries. The remaining strength of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific was distributed between San Diego, Mare Island, and Bremerton, the largest number being at the first-named base, where the auxiliary Procyon served as flagship. In the Atlantic were the following ships, mostly of older types: 6 battleships: New York, Texas, Arkansas, Wyoming, Utah, Florida. 1 modern cruiser, Trenton. Several cruisers of the new 10,000-ton type were completing, but were not immediately ready for sea. 9 older cruisers: Pittsburgh, Pueblo, St. Louis, Rochester, Birmingham, Chester, Olympia, Chattanooga, Des Moines. 2 aircraft carriers: Lexington, Wright. 160 destroyers, all of first line. A few second-line destroyers still existed but were pronounced unfit for active service. 70 submarines of various types, none being fit for long-distance cruising with the battle fleet. 6 patrol vessels, mostly armed yachts, several more of which were acquired later. 4 destroyer tenders: Dobbin, Whitney, Denebola, Bridgeport. 5 submarine tenders: Bushnell, Fulton, Beaver, Camden, Savannah. 2 mine layers: Shawmut, San Francisco. 30 minesweepers of Bird class. 1 repair ship, Vestal. 32 miscellaneous auxiliaries, including oilers, colliers, supply ships, hospital ships, etc. Great difficulty was found in manning destroyers and other vessels brought forward from reserve at the outbreak of war, and in view of the situation created by the closing of the Panama Canal, 50% of the complements of the scouting fleet in the Atlantic were transported overland to complete the crews of the undermanned Pacific Fleet. The strength of the scouting fleet was made up with new recruits, of which large numbers were being drafted to sea by the Navy Recruiting Bureau. A fair number of these had served before, but the majority were new to naval life, and even those with previous experience were necessarily ignorant of the latest improvements in gunnery and other branches. Without exaggeration, it may safely be said that in the earlier stages of the war, the shortage of trained personnel gave American admirals more cause for anxiety than the maneuvers of the enemy.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.